So what do we got? What is Common Core? Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative. And that makes it sound, doesn't it? Like all the states got together and did this. It didn't happen that way. There was almost no input from any individual state, particularly in the crafting of these standards. Right? Later on down the line, after they've been written, funded, and approved, there was feelers sent out to states. But no state had anything to do with this. No state governor had anything to do with this. No state legislature had a say in this. No moms and dads were consulted on it. Nothing. No one has ever voted on this curriculum. One of the things you're going to see today, I'm going to make a lot of comparisons, and for reasons you will see, between Obamacare and Common Core, simply because it's the only thing we have that in any way, shape, or form replicates the kind of broad federal takeover of something as big as education. So you'll see, and also, not coincidentally, there are many places in that huge Obamacare legislation that mandate the schools, particularly the public schools, to become health gathering and data mining institutions in the name of healthcare. I'll show you those documents as well. So Common Core is an abbreviated term, Common Core State Standards. It's a set of, all we have so far officially are English and math, right? A set of national standards for English and mathematics. The science is already forthcoming, and that's interesting. Math and English have received such colossally bad reviews from state to state to state. Not uniformly bad, obviously, but really bad reviews. That the new forthcoming science standards aren't called Common Core. They've learned the branding Common Core is already such a hot button issue that the coming science standards are simply called Next Generation Science. They're Common Core science standards. But they've already figured out that Common Core doesn't brand well, right? So they're coming. In reality, the standards that we know as Common Core in English and math, they were written by two small Washington lobbyist groups. In fact, 5 people can be traced back to the creation of the standards. 5. Almost none of them were professors of any academic subject. None. These people were funded, these 2 Washington lobbyist groups, were funded to the tune of $150 million by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The standards themselves were written behind closed doors. Nobody saw them. Nobody voted on them. And you think about this for a second, too. Regardless of what your politics are, because you'll see today, this is a huge bipartisan issue. It's not a conservative issue, a Republican issue. It's not a Catholic issue versus a secular issue. Ask yourself this question. The copyright for this curriculum is owned by these 2 Washington, and I'll show it to you real quick. There it is. There's the copyright. The 2 groups in question, the National Governors Association and the CCSSO. These are the 2 groups. And I know what you think when you hear National Governors Association. Well, did all the governors have a say in this? No. Are there some sitting governors in the NGA? Yeah. Are there some retired governors in the NGA? Yes. Did they have anything to do with Common Core? No, not a thing. The CCSSO, they copyrighted this. The NGA Center and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of Common Core state standards, and no claims to the contrary shall be made. So, the curriculum that now affects every public school kid in this country, and a solid majority of Christian and Catholic school students as well, is not owned by the federal government. It's not owned by the Department of Education. It's not owned by the states. It's not owned by the teachers. It's not owned by the moms and dads. It's owned by 2 small Washington lobbyist groups who received, as we speak now, $250 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Whatever your politics, how is this acceptable? Go back. How did we get it? If these 2 small Washington lobbyist groups wrote it, and a billionaire, philanthropist, financier paid for it, how do all these states have to take it now? You keep hearing, and you saw it in the copyright, right? You keep hearing from people who defend Common Core, these aren't federal standards, it's not a federal curriculum. Well, wait a second. How did it become law then? Because those 2 lobbyist groups didn't have the ability to make it law, and Bill Gates, for all his money, has no authority whatsoever to convince or force any state to take anything. Well, way back in 2009, President Barack Obama created a program. Have you heard of it? Race to the Top. Remember what Race to the Top was? 5 years ago, before the Common Core standards in English and math were even written, Barack Obama created Race to the Top. Arne Duncan, the Department of Education, Federal Department of Education. And Race to the Top handed out billions and billions of taxpayer dollars to the states. It was, at the time, it was called a stimulus for education. Give you an example. New York State received $700 million in 2009. $700 million. And the only catch, the only stipulation for getting that money was that New York had to accept Common Core standards when they were finally written. That's how 46 states in the Union, including Wisconsin. Oh, and by the way, Wisconsin has the distinction of being the first state in the Union to take Common Core. Thank you, Tony Evers. Right? It's debatable. You know, the irony about how much we took. We didn't even take the immediate Race to the Top monies. But it's been documented beyond dispute that Wisconsin has so far received over $22 million because we took it. Right? The bottom line is we can't see the books on that. But we have documentation that while not taking money in the initial round of Race to the Top program money, that Wisconsin has received over $22 million so far. And it's probably higher than that. But we were the first state in the Union. I mean, gee, Tony, if you're going to take it, take the $700 million, right? But we were the first state in the Union to take it. 46 states. That's how 46... And if you're a state, right, what state's going to turn down that? 5 years ago? Without having seen the standards, you're going to give me how many millions? Massachusetts got $400 million, right? States all across the Union received these huge payouts. And you're telling us we can have the money now, and 4 or 5 years from now, when these standards are written, we have to take them, so be it. Well, 4 or 5 years later, here we are. You think about this for a second. It's pretty shocking. Again, politics aside, if instead of Bill and Melinda Gates, two very liberal activists, what if it was the evil Koch brothers? And instead of two small liberal Washington lobbyist groups, what if it was a couple of right-wing lobbyist groups on K Street? And if instead of a very liberal president, what if you had a very conservative one, who basically bribed the states to take something they had not seen as law? I don't know about you, but I'd be just as opposed to it as I am now. Again, whatever your even if you think there is something of merit in Common Core, how do you justify this? And that's never been answered. I have never heard a single defender of Common Core answer that question. Even if it turns out to be the greatest curriculum in the world, how can you justify doing it this way? And how can you justify it not belonging to anybody but two small lobbyist groups? How can the curriculum that dictates now, the standards and the corresponding curriculum that dictate what our kids will learn and how they'll learn it, how do you justify the fact that that is owned by these two groups? Before we even get into the standards, this is a question that cannot be ignored. And from the Catholic perspective, Catholic and Christian schools, how do you justify taking this curriculum? How do you justify taking it when you know who's behind it? Bill and Melinda Gates? Here's a little factoid for you. The only thing Bill and Melinda Gates have spent more of their foundation money on than Common Core is population control and abortion in Africa. All right? You think about that for a second if you're a Catholic school. And what's really shocking about the Catholic and Christian schools, private schools, what's really shocking is that the federal government didn't even ask you to take it, and you rushed to the front of the line to take it. That's wonderful. The same group that gave us the Health and Human Service mandate, right, that the church is now fighting for its very right of conscience not to provide abortion services for employees. That same government that gave you this. Right? And our bishops knew nothing about it. Those 26 bishops I talked to you about, until I explained to them what Common Core was, they didn't know. They just didn't know. When we had the hearings in Wisconsin 3 and 4 months ago across the state, every single politician we talked to didn't know what Common Core was. The vast majority of politicians on the hearings to determine if Common Core was good or bad didn't know what Common Core... Well, why would they? They didn't tell you. They didn't tell anybody. This is not I mean, while it's a bipartisan problem, it's awfully hard to blame in the same way you can't blame teachers and superintendents, you really can't blame the Congress or the Senate in Wisconsin. You can't blame Governor Walker. He had nothing to do with this. Although, as we'll see, you can certainly be disappointed in the way they're dealing with it. But they didn't bring it here. There's your copyright. In fact, the Department of Education's two top lawyers back in 2010 both wrote briefs. The Attorney General for Education, the chief lawyer and his assistant, both wrote briefs arguing that the race to the top scheme and all of this national testing that goes along with it is illegal. Violates 3 federal statutes. And you get, when I say we're talking about Department of Education lawyers, we are not talking about screaming right-wingers. They write the following. With respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, and you get what I'm saying, right? So you see the little bait and switch here? The standards are copyrighted by these 2 Washington lobbyist groups, and no claims to the contrary shall be made. So that's when you hear them say it's not a federal curriculum, they're not federal standards. But then, how do you account for the federal government paying for them, basically, bribing states to take them? How do you account? And then there's the testing. Because when you look behind the testing consortiums, both of them, the 2 main testing consortiums that are going to, across every state, measure this, they go right back to the federal government. So you see the bait and switch here, right? It's their curriculum, not ours. But that is utterly implausible, given race to the top and given who runs the testing consortium. And that's really what makes it a national curriculum, whether you want to admit it or not. It doesn't matter, because if it's not, then why can't Wisconsin have their own tests? And why can't Michigan do separate tests? But that's not the way it works. You have to be part of one of these 2 big testing consortiums, don't you? And that all comes out of the feds. Right? The dishonesty of this. In my mind, I think they learned a lot from Obamacare. You remember, give them credit for Obamacare. It went to the House, it went to the Senate, it went to the Supreme Court. People talked about it. Whether you like the law or hate the law is irrelevant. At least it had its hearing, right? This they never talked about. They never told you about. No one's ever had a hearing on it. And now, you think about this, again, whatever side of this issue you're on, you think about this. Now it's the law of the land. No one in Wisconsin knew anything about it before we took it, with the possible exception of Tony Evers. Although, did any of you hear Tony Evers' testimony in Madison during the first hearing? He testified in Madison for an hour and a half. He could not, and you could watch this online. Don't believe me. Type in was Tony Evers' testimony in Madison. He couldn't answer a single question about Common Core. When the state legislature, the congressmen and the senators, they grilled him on Common Core. Okay, you say this whole curriculum, this whole set of standards, it's been benchmarked internationally. Tell us one country against which it's been benchmarked. Just one. Couldn't do it. He could not do it. I was at all 4 hearings. He kept saying, well, we'll get that information, we'll get that information. Each of the 4 hearings, the committee said, well, do you have, the DPI representatives were there. Do you have that? Oh, we don't have that yet. And they never provided it. Ever. You can see the hearings. Go online and watch it. So the 2 lawyers, with respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent T. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and the tests and the assessments will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in all the states in the Union that took it, in most states across the nation, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a nationalized K-12 program, and raising a fundamental question about whether the Department of Education is exceeding its statutory boundaries. The race to the top application, the initial vehicle through which Common Core was imposed on the states, requires the applicants to adopt, quote, a set of content standards that are substantially identical across all the states in the consortium. Now you think about this too, a couple of things. We've seen this before, I've admitted to you we've seen it before. This is nothing new. So why is Common Core such a big deal? Well, the difference. You remember how many of you remember No Child Left Behind? All right. Now, we remember who was president when No Child Left Behind was conceived. Who was it? Republican George W. Bush. And George W. Bush looked around in 2002 like every president before him for the last 40 years, coincidentally, right about when the feds got involved in a big time scale. He looked around and he saw that education was a disaster, so he wanted to fix it. Who remembers? Who did George W. Bush commission to write that law, No Child Left Behind? Teddy Kennedy. So George W. Bush, that's bipartisanship, isn't it? And by the way, can you give me an example? I'm just curious. Can you give me an example of the last time a very liberal president ceded something as big to a Republican senator? Didn't think so. But there's your bipartisanship, right? So Teddy Kennedy wrote No Child Left Behind. And as I've already alluded to you, it's been a disaster. I mean this sincerely. I'm looking for the first one. I have yet to meet a teacher, a teacher's union person, a principal, a vice principal, a superintendent. I've yet to meet anyone in education who has anything but contempt for No Child Left Behind. It's a disaster. And why was No Child Left Behind a disaster? Because it was outcome-based education, number one. Rather than meeting kids where they are and instilling flexibility and diversity in how you teach kids, and allowing states, local school boards, even moms and dads in particular schools to be flexible enough with curriculum to figure out what works for their kids. No, that's not what we did. Outcome-based education. You set a standard, and you insist that every kid has to meet that standard in every subject. How many of you have kids or grandkids? Okay, let me ask you a question. Can you get your son and your daughter, your grandson and your granddaughter, to do as well, to do the same in every single subject? How can you? You can't get your own kids. Inevitably, if your son is into reading and history, your daughter's going to be into math and science. And even if your kids are all geniuses, they're still going to excel in certain subjects better, but that's not good enough for things like No Child Left Behind or for Common Core. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but in the last last 2 years, we've lost more gifted, talented education programs in our public schools than in the previous 20 years combined. Why? Because if the point is to get kids to an arbitrary standard, you can't have kids overachieving, any more than you can have them failing. And you remember, what happens in outcome-based education? Well, it's what's happening in your schools now, and what's happening over No Child Left Behind. Teachers teaching to tests. Because all that matters is the test. When you create a situation where the test is everything, and look, people say all the time, Republicans, conservatives, you should love standards. Well, isn't education by definition a standard? You see the zero-sum game that we play with this? If you oppose Common Core, you're against standards. As if the only option to Common Core is chaos in our schools. You heard that with Obamacare, didn't you? If you oppose Obamacare, you want to see people die in the streets, right? We heard that before. As if somehow the idea that outcome-based education, just because they're standards, well, we saw it for 13 years in No Child Left Behind. The standards got perpetually walked back. Kids spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks testing and being taught to prepare for tests. That's the whole go-around there. And how many of you remember what happened in North Carolina, New York City, and Atlanta, Georgia? You remember the scandals we had? Where teachers and principals were getting the kids standardized testing, dumping it in the trash, and filling out the new ones and getting the answers right. Because their jobs depended on it. Is that accountability? This was a huge national scandal. Teachers all over the country and principals all over the country dumping tests and forging new ones. Because you couldn't get the kids to the same standard all the time. You can't do it in your own family. How are you going to do it with 40 million American school kids? It doesn't make any sense. That's why No Child Left Behind was a failure. How about, besides the high-stakes testing, besides the outcome-based education, how about the fact that this is rank socialism? I know. When you say a word like that, everybody thinks you put the tinfoil hat on. But think about it. What is outcome-based education? It doesn't matter what you put into something. It doesn't matter whether you're talented or not. It doesn't matter whether you try or not. It doesn't matter whether you're good at that subject or not. All that matters is when you're done, everybody's at the same place. Isn't that socialism? What do you call that if not socialism? If there's a place for the federal government in education, it seems to me that place would be in guaranteeing kids have access. Give kids access to school. And I am a classic example of this. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a freshman in college reading level. And so consequently, I was allowed to read 8th and 9th grade, 10th grade books in 3rd grade. I was allowed to go, for English class, sit with the 8th graders and read big people books because I could. But in 3rd grade, my math was 2nd grade level. It still is. I mean, I have enough math to balance a checkbook and pay my bills, but I can't do anything more than that. I really can't. But the point is that math was never going to be my thing. And while when I took my mandatory math class in college, the professor pulled me aside at the end of the term and he said, "Son, I'm giving you a pity C-. He said, don't take any more math classes. And he's right. He was right. But that wasn't my area. But I was allowed to thrive in the area that I could thrive in, and my math is okay. Under Common Core and No Child Left Behind, that has to change now. Why are we losing these programs for high-achieving kids? Oh, and the other thing, there's one absolute point of agreement between extreme liberals and extreme conservatives on Common Core. They hate it because of what it does to special needs kids. Not surprisingly, if overachievers you can't have somebody above the standard because that skews the standard. You cannot have kids below it. They're already making arrangements. They're already talking about this in the Department of Education. They want any special needs child, and that doesn't necessarily mean developmentally challenged. That may just mean dyslexic or ADHD. They want these kids removed from the public school environment and put in separate institutional schools so they don't skew the curve. We have a number of extreme liberal groups in the state, including, believe it or not, the Occupy Wall Street people in Wisconsin oppose Common Core vehemently on the basis of that alone, right?